Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I apologize for my bad throat. I'll try to be highlighting our project, which I think is a good example for interdisciplinary collaboration, which was, I think, triggered and actually was made possible by the establishment of the Tel Aviv Nano Center. As you can see here, it's a collaboration mainly between Yossi Shacham, who is not here unfortunately, somewhere in the Himalayas, and my group together with Judith Rishpon, who is from our department. And this has culminated recently in a series of PhD and MSc programs of shared students, typically coming from both directions, I must say. But we do have students, and this is one of examples, that the student starts with biology background, moves then to a second degree, an MSc in biotechnology, and ends up as a PhD in electrical engineering. This is done in a very natural way in which we combine our efforts to bring together, merging and integrating together a biological moiety with the electronic device. The idea we're talking about here is what we call the hybrids. Hybrids are integrated, either molecular or cellular, biologically active moieties that we prepare by means of affecting what we call protein-mediated biotemplating. This is a term that I've established already back in 2006. And what we are dealing with or doing in our lab, and I will simply highlight it here without going too much into details. I appreciate your patience anyhow. And what we're talking about is that in our joint effort, we are affecting directed metallization of either soluble proteins, biologically active proteins at the molecular level, or do it with crystallized proteins, namely protein crystals serving as biotemplate, three-dimensional one, or cell-displayed proteins. So at all three levels, we do have projects going on, and they are all being used as biotemplates for directed metallization, namely the addition of a thin layer or tiny nanoparticles made of metal. And this is not done just for fun. The idea behind this is to bring into practice what we see on the right lower corner, and that is some kind of self-assembly of such integrated units. Here they are demonstrated in the older fashion, and we would like to work with them as a nanosystem which is functional. That means that at least one dimension, or preferably more than one dimension, will be under 100 nanometers in size. Now, as such proteins, which are the smallest units I'm talking about, are a few nanometers in size, each one of them, we are talking about a relatively small number of such units. Namely, that throughout this process, we must take care that the biological activity will be preserved and maintained, and that they will have an excellent way of communication with the supporting conducting electronic circuit. The idea is briefly described here. What you see at the upper part is the situation when we are talking about an oxidoreductase enzyme, for instance, the glucose oxidizing enzymes, usually referred to as glucose oxidase, in which we can see that within the active site, we have a molecule of glucose coming in. It is being oxidized by the enzyme, and its electrons and protons are transferred into what you may call an intermediate local reservoir. It's an FAD molecule, which will take these electrons and keep it there. And if there'll be no one to unload these electrons and send them elsewhere, there'll be no second round. So if we have the surface of this molecule coated with a thin layer of a nicely conducted metal, the best one recommended to us was silver, we may have a direct electron transfer from this active site to the electrode onto which it has been attached, first by adsorption and then additional coating. The situation with working with whole cells is a bit different. Since at the cellular level, we are talking about micron size. If we're talking about this cross-section of an E. coli cell, we are talking about roughly 0.5 micron. So a conducting layer on the surface, why should it do us any good or any service? The idea is that if we have, in this case, substrate penetrating the cells and being converted by intracellular enzymatic system, then a product is formed, making its way out. Now, if we wish to have that detected by the supporting electrode, we should have or make sure that the number of product molecules effectively reaching the electrode surface and therefore interacting with them and being counted will be maximal. That won't happen since most of them will diffuse into the other randomized directions. Now, if we shall have the surface coated with a conducting layer, then whenever they reach the outer surface, they'll be immediately oxidized, reduced, or whatever, interact with the surface, since what we have done actually is to integrate the surface with the supporting conducting layer. That is basically the idea. The big question is, of course, how to do it. And the way to do it is to prepare when we talk about the simplest level, which is the molecular soluble biologically active enzyme metal hybrid. We developed the concept of directed electrolyte deposition carried out under mild physiological conditions. The major idea is to have the biological activity preserved throughout the process, so it should be carried out not under the conditions that are routinely employed in the clean room for the electrolyte deposition, which is routinely carried out as part of the Fab-mediated production lines, but something that has been modified so we can really use it for our purposes under this condition. The idea was that we should start with modifying the surface of a protein, and this is based on know-how that we gained from our work on processing aspects of biocatalysis, modifying enzymes, having them immobilized, coupled to polymers, used in continuous flow systems and so on and so forth. And in this case, what we designed, just to give you a feeling of it, is to affect surface modification by polymer attachment. It's not just the polymer, but a polymer that will form nucleation sites that will provide us with the nucleation sites, and from that moment on, we can add to that by an enlargement procedure. And what we can do is either to produce a reducing agent on the surface of the enzymes, so this reduction will take place solely or primarily over there, and then as an alternative, we can have a nucleating ion that will be conjugated by a complexing agent. Now, the first, I think, of these was presented in another nano meeting, I think already at Ma'agan, and published in the Journal of Physical Chemistry already back in 2007. I'll go into it very briefly. It involves the use of a polymer that we found out that we can provide it with silver-reducing moieties, and we use the glucose oxidase as model. It has an extremely important analytical application, such as for the daily monitoring of glucose level in the blood of diabetic patients. So we are talking about this reaction. As you can see, normally, or under natural conditions, what we get is that oxygen is the electron acceptor with this system, and we may end up with hydrogen peroxide, which may be measured or should be destroyed because it is I think, a negative, from our point of view, product that may interfere with the enzyme in its biological activity. This is how this enzyme looks like. It reminds us as a pinnet with two active sites. And what we have done is this kind of modification. Now, the main point here is that we start and end up in a soluble form of the enzyme, which may be applied now onto the surface of, for instance, a platinum electrode. have it absorbed, covered with a Nafion membrane, and then we can measure the current that is formed as a result of its interaction with glucose, by having it correlated with the glucose level. As you can see here, we can see that the silver that is covering the surface of this enzyme creates kind of relatively large curly patches with quite crystalline morphology. And we have, first of all, verified that the biological enzymatic activity was retained, and indeed it was. I'll go through it very briefly. And then we went to see how it will behave on the surface of an electrode. As I was mentioning before, this was presented within this form before. And the reason I bring it up again is just to remind you again that within this system, we were able to show that we can carry out such measurements in the absence of oxygen. Now, this is very important, crucial for the practical application of such systems. And the important point that I wanted to mention is that we started with this, as I was saying, about 3-4 years ago. We have recently been approached by a large company who is interested in implementing our technology to develop such sensors for practical purposes. And we are now negotiating it, and I do hope it will become into practice. Now, another point that we worked on, and this was, I think, already mentioned also in the previous talk, was how can we expand this into other metals? Silver is really nice, but what about other metals? And we developed an alternative method which is based on the formation of nucleation sites which are based on palladium ions. This was published last year in IEEE Transactions on Nanotechnology, as you can see here. Anyone interested, by the way, can communicate me and get a copy. And this can be used for either the formation of a palladium coat on the enzyme, or we can start with nucleation sites made of palladium and take it there with other metals. And that may bring us into the field of magnetic, biologically active enzymes and other proteins. And this is how it looks like. Look on the left-hand side. You can see how this coating may look like. These are patches which looks a bit different from the regular way that you just have a palladium reduced by the same reducer on the, let's say, the classical way it's usually done. And I'll go very briefly through this because I would like to move into what we may update. So we get again here the observation that we can use it for glucose determination in the absence of oxygen. But I would like now to mention that this was recently expanded, these techniques, for the preparation of binding protein metal hybrids. Now, this is really interesting because here we're talking about one of the classical of them all. This work was not published yet, but we are going to submit it for publication next month. And here we're talking about the Abedin biotin system, which is one of the most frequently used in analytical and biochemical tests. There's a very specific binding of the vitamin biotin by this protein, which comes from the eggs. And this is a protein which has 4 binding sites. It's a tetrameric form. And what we have done is, again, to demonstrate to you that this can be done in a very, very controlled manner. As you can see, we can play with the amount of metal that has been added, as you can see from the different colors. Unfortunately, we don't see it, but you can clearly see that we can play with it and add more and more metal as we wish, until at a certain point it will start aggregate. And that's something we don't wish to happen. Now, we have tested this and demonstrated that the capacity of specifically binding of its ligands was maintained and preserved. Now, this is very important because it has opened and paved the way for us to implement this technology for the preparation of antibody metal hybrids, on which we are working right now. It's interesting to mention here that not only that the biological activity was preserved, it was actually improved, because this way of coating provided us with several, I can't say unexpected, but highly desirable advantages, technological advantages. First of all, thermal stability was higher. It was more resistant to proteolytic digestion. And what we believe, haven't shown yet, is that it will also result with reduced immunogenicity. That is something we would like to explore and demonstrate, but we have good reasons to believe that we can do that. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, we can also play with the preparation of magnetic such particles. So potential applications for such binding protein-metal hybrids include in vitro and in vivo molecular imaging, because they are maintained in solution. They will have large circulation times. We can use them also for fabrication of electronic biosensor. We can use it for targeted antimicrobial agents, especially with silver, and also targeted anti-cancer agents. This is a project that we have just initiated. Last but not least, I don't have much time to go into this, but we have also sorted out the question of how can we apply a metallic coating onto the surface of a whole cell. And we, after working hard for a long time, found out that we should not simply hope that it could be just an extension of what we have done at the molecular level. Since most of these metal ions are highly toxic for cells. For instance, silver ions, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, is one of the most commonly employed antibiotic agent that is used even for the worst cases of treating, for instance, chronic wounds and the like. And therefore, it is highly toxic for the cells and will kill them instantaneously. So what would you do with this? The bottom line is that you should approach them with prefabricated nanometallic particles and have them attached to the surface while preserving their capability of serving as a conducting layer. Now, last but not least, it's also very important that if we are talking about the integration of such hybrids with electrodes, we should bring into consideration the impact that such coating may have on the adsorption, which means a kind of self-attachment or immobilization of either the cells or the enzymes onto the envisaged electrode, either gold, platinum, plastic carbon, whatever. Here we have an example of gold electrodes, and we have found out, luckily enough, that if we, for instance, will take E. coli cells, have them covered with nanoparticles made of gold, according to our method, it will significantly improve the attachment. Now, this is very important because it may allow us to take, for instance, nanoliters of samples, simply apply them at a predetermined spot, and they will stay there. And usually we don't have to do anything else. They will stay there, they will attach themselves, so self-immobilize themselves onto the surface, enabling termination of the envisaged monitoring that we would like to do. And here we are talking mainly on environmental monitoring. Now, last but not least, I would like to mention some related ongoing projects in our lab. And this includes, as I mentioned earlier, antibody metal hybrids, the conversion of this concept into the synthesis area, mostly using the enzyme known as cytochrome P450. And we would like also to use enzyme metal hybrids that will be self-assembled on conducting surfaces, namely not will be just randomly attached, but they will arrange themselves in a highly ordered, two-dimensional, crystalline-like morphology. And these are just a few examples. I would like to mention that the biotemplating is a major route in our lab, and it is a combination at the all three level of efforts coming in from collaboration carried out with several groups, two of them from my own department, which is biotechnology, and the other one is with Yossi Shacham. Altogether, for this time, Just to illustrate that, we have a postdoc, 7 PhD students, 2 MSc students, and I regret to say that I'm turning down students every week. And this is really frustrating, I must say, because lack of scholarships, because lack of space, funding opportunities, and the like. There's enormous interest from students coming from both directions into this kind of field. I really apologize that I was doing it in such a rush, but after all, it's getting late, time is short, and you have made my day saying that I'm just a student. Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience.
I've seen the reaction. I think it was very fast. I'm not sure of I think it was Nika reaction. The amino gets attacked with the double bond there. Is it for using for a pellet for the palladium? And the third question is, don't you have any problem with the palladium ion not diffused around the enzyme? That's it.
Okay. First of all, about the stability. We are now just entering the phase that we will look into the question of how long can we use this integrated system for continuous monitoring, for instance, or continuous operation for biosynthesis. We haven't done that yet, but we do know that the preservation of the stability of the enzyme within this hybrid is very high and actually getting improved. And we have been using our accumulating know-how for the past 25 years of working with enzymes, stabilizing them, preserving the activity, and so on and so forth. So I don't have a data to show you about that, though we can definitely say that such solutions that I've shown can be maintained on the shelf at room temperature for several weeks. Some of them were stable for 8 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, and we simply didn't follow it later, but we intend to do that. So this is for the first question. Now your second question, I would like to simply suggest that you take a look at our publications, and you'll see all details there. I don't think I can easily explain it, but I would like to take the time of these patient people here for this purpose. Last thing about the palladium, certain enzymes and definitely cells will find palladium ion presence as being highly toxic. That's correct. But not always. But it's definitely enough that if the biological activity will go down, let's say, by 1/3 or so, it's not a big tragedy. We can still use it and work with it. It's a general thing, and we can work with really small amounts if we would like to use the palladium only for nucleation side, take it from there for other less toxic ions such as copper, for instance, and so on. So we can play with that. We're working on it now.
Can you compare your approach of binding enzymes to electrode to the one practiced by ethanol Freeman in terms of efficiency or ion transfer, stability?
Well, that's a very delicate question. The mechanism of electron transfer suggested by Willer was very different. The most famous one, because there were several, was throughout a entirely different mechanism. What it did was, first of all, to take this FAD moiety from the enzyme outside, have it conjugated chemically to a small gold nanoparticle, and then have it reconstructed. That brings a big question mark to my test. And that's exactly the question that Itamar usually doesn't like that you've been asked about. And that is that there should be a spherical hindrance and diffusion limitation for allowing the substrate to go in and the product to go out. There must be. Another problem is that working this way will mean that the flux of electrons can go through this nanoparticle, and that means that half of the enzyme will sit lazily with its face in the other direction, because it looks like a pinner. It's a dimer. It usually ignores that. And that's very interesting, because this is a science publication. And I really don't wish to elaborate.
And you don't face all those problems.
It's even more. You're dragging out of it. It's even more provocative, because he reported that as a result of this maneuver, the activity or the turnover number of the enzyme has increased dramatically for this conjugate versus the native enzyme. That's something I must say that people, experts in the field, find it puzzling. I beg your pardon?
I mean, what's the relative activity?
We didn't do any comparisons. Directive is that, focus is this.
Okay. Thank you very much. The last speaker is Karen Miller, and after that we'll have the brief session. מחשבים